this lesson, we will continue our discussion on the courts of the common law by having a look at the King's Bench. Now, in the previous lessons, we had a look at the courts of the Exchequer as well as the Court of the Common Pleas. On the one hand, the Court of Exchequer was primarily tasked with collection and disputes in relation to a debt owed to the crown or to the king, whereas conversely, the Court of the Common Pleas was primarily tasked with disputes between individuals. So what you'd note from here is the very first distinction between citizen and state versus citizens themselves. The King's Bench, on the other hand, is quite akin to the Court of Exchequer. However, unlike the more civil aspect of the Court of Exchequer, the King's Bench primarily dealt with criminal procedure, something we will have a look at later on. Now, since the 14th century, the King's Bench has been primarily established and centralized within Westminster, something that we looked at quite early on in this series of lessons as well, where we looked at what amounts to the King's Council and how the different courts, namely the Exchequer, the Common Pleas, the King's Bench, as well as something we'll look at later, which is the Court of Chancery, how all of these were now centralized within Westminster rather than being decentralized into the various shires and hundreds, like we discussed in our lesson on the Anglo-Saxon legal system. Now, the King's Bench, because it represented the King's Justice, so to speak, consisted of mainly legally skilled counselors, and they pretty much traveled with the king himself. Whenever the king, however, presided over any particular matter, this would be considered as what is known as a coram rege, or in the presence of the king. At one point of time, the King's Bench, as we looked at in our lesson on the Common Pleas as well, became centralized within criminal procedure, and it dealt solely with that of criminal procedure alone. Now, quite interestingly, and this is why this lesson is important as well, people began exploiting the bill procedure of the King's Bench in order to sue for other claims. If you went through the lesson previously on the Court of the Common Pleas, as well as that of the Exchequer, you'd note that in order to bring proceedings to court, specifically that of the Common Pleas, you needed to invoke one of the King's writs, a writ in order to summon a particular defendant to court. Now, this process was also a mechanism for the Crown to make money. It was a mechanism by which they earned revenue, which meant that it was at one point quite expensive for a normal litigant to pursue. However, since this is criminal in nature in terms of any proceedings before the King's Bench, the bill procedure was, on the one hand, less onerous in terms of how difficult it was, and secondly, it was much cheaper. It was less expensive than a writ. So the next thing that we have to then look at is how exactly were litigants able to exploit it. Firstly, what happened was that the bills that we are discussing in this lesson, these bills could be used to commence action against prisoners, anyone who is in custody. So the reason why this was possible was, unlike a writ where you had to summon and a person had to be brought before court, if someone was a prisoner, he or she was deemed to be already in court. Therefore, no process to bring them in was necessary, like that of a writ. Secondly, the way in which this was manifested was that you would have a litigant who would make a false accusation, say for instance on trespass, on a particular defendant, which would mean that said individual, because of the lackluster means of distilling justice, that particular person would actually be arrested. And once that is done, then a genuine bill to charge him would be brought in relation to a civil claim. So this made the King's Bench quite popular in retrospect compared to the Court of the Common Pleas. But what it initially meant was, ironically, that the King's Bench was a haven for these fictitious bills by individuals, and it was somewhat counterproductive to consider a particular court of law that was meant to dispense justice that in reality was actually based on false fabrications and lies. The way in which this was possible, however, the reason how a person could be accused and then brought before court as well without much questioning whatsoever, was because you need to understand that in the UK at the time, there was no such thing as a police force. So the citizens themselves, the litigants themselves, were tasked with finding the perpetrators and bringing them to justice. What this meant was there was no check on whether these claims or these charges were fabricated or real. So this government dependence on private individuals was, in one sense, a mechanism that actually, as a byproduct, improved procedure, but on the other hand, meant that there was a lot of injustices happening in relation to defendants. At this point, we have now covered some of the major or pivotal types of courts in relation to the King's Council and the courts of the common law. We've already looked at the Exchequer, we've already looked at Court of the Common Pleas, and now we've just covered King's Bench. Before we move on to one of the more vast as well as controversial at times courts, which is the Court of Chancery, we will have a look at what is known as the IR system or itinerant justices. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Make sure you check out some of my other courses available online and reach out for the tutoring masterclasses through the links below. Have fun, stay safe, and as always, obey the law.